Hey guys, it's Christa Watson here from Christa Quilts, and I'm back with another fun quilt for you to make. My color weave quilt shown behind me was made from one of my earlier fabric collections that's now out of print. However, you can get a similar look by choosing fabrics from your stash in a rainbow of colors. I love how the bright pop of color contrasts against the tan neutrals in the desert area which I live. So you can make your version of color weave from pre-cut strips just like I did, or you can make them from fat quarters or yardage, depending on the look you're going for. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the entire process, including how the quilt top goes together. It's all about the color placement of the individual blocks, and you can really have fun playing around with different combinations. Then I'm going to spend some time showing you all the rest of the steps of the quilt, how to baste the quilt, how to machine quilt it, and how to bind it by machine. I want you to have confidence that you can make this quilt from start to finish, and I'm here to cheer you on every step of the way. All you need is a copy of the quilt pattern to follow along. So let's get started. Each pieced color weave in this quilt requires 2 pre-cut strips that are 2.5 inches wide by 42 inches long. So look for a strip roll that has duplicates for best results. You'll need a total of 17 different colors, but you can always make it larger or smaller, and you can supplement from your stash. If you don't have duplicates in a roll, then I recommend using fat quarters instead. The color weave quilt pattern includes cutting instructions for both. If you want to go in a different direction and leave the rainbow completely behind, you can go for a totally minimalist look by cutting your palette down to just a couple of colors, like this yellow and gray version seen here. You can experiment with background fabrics too, as long as they have good contrast. I used my light and dark gray confetti crosshatch fabrics for my backgrounds. Now take a look at the recoloring I did using black and gray backgrounds instead. Once you have your fabrics all picked out, it's time to cut them up. Follow the cover weave pattern instructions on pages 2 to 4 to cut out all of the individual units to sew your blocks. Now I know what you might be thinking. Why don't I sew together the pre-cut strips first and then cut them apart? Well, you absolutely can do that. However, every time I've tried to do that in the past, my strips always bow or warp out of shape, or my blocks don't end up the right size because the fabric gets a little bit stretched. So through a lot of experimentation and trial and error, I found that what works for me is to cut everything precisely to size and then sew it together. That way, all I have to worry about is my seam allowance. But just remember, you're the boss of your quilt, so you can do it any way you like. The blocks are basically the same for most of the quilt, but it's really the color placement that creates the weave. When sewing, I'm using 1/4 inch seams and I'm chain piecing, which means I sew one set of units right after another without cutting the threads in between. It really speeds things up. I'm using a stiletto, that pointy thing you see in my hand. It helps me guide the pieces through the machine so that everything stays straight and aligned as I sew. I also have this nifty gadget called a triangle cutter, which helps me clip threads in between each of the chain pieced units. Again, I'm all about being speedy wherever I can. Now it's important to match seams accurately to create that woven design. So here's how I do that. I'm ensuring that the seam lines of the gray units line up across from each other. Then I continue to sew accurately with the stiletto. The open seams help keep the units flat so that nothing shifts while sewing. I'm also using a 1/4 inch dual feed foot that feeds the layers through evenly as I sew. I'll use the dual feed again later on when I'm quilting, but for now it helps with accurate piecing too. I'll do a quick check with my ruler to ensure that my seam lines have matched up accurately. You can refer to the pattern on pages 4 through 6 for correct color placement in each set of blocks. I've included full color diagrams showing exactly which color goes where and how to put the pieces together. And you can make notes in your pattern of which fabrics you are using so it's easy to follow along. When sewing, I recommend lowering your stitch length and pressing all seams open. Because there's a lot of seams in this quilt, this is going to ensure nice flat blocks, which leads to a smooth, flat quilt top that's easy to machine quilt. Pressing my seams open also makes it actually easier to join the blocks together because they fit together any way you rotate them. But again, you're the one that gets to decide which way you'd like to press. This just works for me, so I'm sticking to it. Because I piece and quilt all of my own quilts, I'm always thinking about how the piecing is going to affect the machine quilting and vice versa. I use lots of pins to help my seams line up, and that extra bit of work is worth the results that I get. You can hardly tell where one block ends and the next one begins, and that's the magic of this design. I pin and press every block and every row throughout the quilt to keep the quilt nice and flat the entire time. Once your rows are sewn, I recommend placing them in order on a design wall or other large surface area and taking a picture to refer to so that you can keep the layout in the correct order as you sew. As you can see, I use my design wall a lot. Not only do I use it for block layout and keeping things in order as I sew them together, it also doubles as my photography studio and as my basting wall, which I'm going to show you in just a few moments. Be sure to check out the link in the description box so you can see how to make a design wall for yourself. But don't worry, if you don't have a design wall, you can still use the floor, a table, a bed, any place you have room to lay out your quilt. So now let's get on with the show. So here's an easy way you can measure how much batting you're going to need. Simply roll out enough batting to cover the width of the quilt and then cut it off. Next, I used a few leftover strips and some coordinating fabric to sew the backing. Again, for easy measuring, I just cover up the quilt top as I sew the backing together so that it ends up being about 3 to 4 inches larger than the quilt top on all 4 sides. So here's where my design wall comes in again. I'm using it to base the layers of my quilt. My quick process is this. I take the quilt top and the backing outside and I spray them with basting spray. Then I bring all 3 layers of the quilt inside and assemble them on my design wall. Now don't worry, if you don't have a design wall, you can do the same spray basting process on a table. And it doesn't have to be a very big table. You can just work in sections. Where there's a will, there's a way, and I'm here to cheer you on. I spray the wrong side of the top and backing with 505 basting spray. So first I'll pin the backing to my design wall. You can see it's all scrunched up and sticking to itself, but it pulls apart easily. Next, I'll add the batting and smooth it all out with an acrylic ruler. Then I'll add the quilt top in the same way, ensuring that there's enough batting and backing sticking out on all sides. I'll spend the time smoothing the top layer so that everything is nice and flat and smooth. Then I'll trim off most of the excess batting and backing, leaving only about 1 inch or 2 all the way around. Finally, I'll iron both sides of the quilt to set the glue. This also allows me to work out any wrinkles that may have formed during the process. And now we're at my favorite part of the whole quilt making process, the machine quilting. The way I approach the quilting on this quilt is I work very methodically. I start on the right-hand side of the quilt, work my way towards the center, rotate the quilt, and then start in the center and work my way back out again. I found that this is the easiest way to control the bulk, and I do it in a methodical way. I'm going to be quilting straight lines on my quilt using a process I call divide and conquer. You can do this with either a walking foot or a dual feed system like I'm going to demonstrate. Either way, it's going to get the job done. So first, I'm going to quilt wider space lines based on the size of my finished quilt blocks. Then I'm going to divide up that space and I'm going to quilt lines narrower and narrower until the entire area is filled. I'll go back across the quilt in several passes, adding more lines of stitching each time I go. The beautiful thing about this technique is that you can decide at any point that you've had enough with the quilting and you are finished. By dividing and conquering the quilting process, it spreads the density of the quilting evenly across the quilt. And by anchoring some of the lines in the seams to begin with, it's going to ensure that your quilt doesn't shift as you're quilting it. Anything you can do to make the process easier is what I'm going for. So let's take a look. I'm machine quilting my color weave quilt with 2 different spools from my variegated collection. You can see the numbers here. 1 spool of each will be plenty of thread to quilt this large quilt with a very dense design. For this design, I'll start by stitching in the ditch every 2 inches because that's the finished width of my fabric strips. By using the seam lines as a guide while I quilt, I don't have to mark anything. Whenever there's not a seam to follow, I can just eyeball a straight line when it's only a couple of inches wide. I'll stitch in the ditch in both directions, vertically and horizontally, so that I'll be quilting an anchor grid that's 2 inches apart across the whole quilt. However, while I'm stitching, it's all going to feel like I'm stitching in the same direction from the top of the quilt to the bottom. I just rotate the quilt as needed. My seams have been pressed open and there's absolutely no issue with stitching in the ditch. Contrary to popular myth, this will not weaken your seams. In fact, it actually strengthens your seams because you're laying down another layer of stitching, holding everything securely in place. After I've quilted the grid by stitching in the ditch in both directions, I'm now quilting randomly spaced lines across the quilt. First, I used the edge of my foot as a guide for 2 of the rows of stitching lines on either side of the seam. Then I moved the foot and placed it next to my previously stitched line to quilt more lines without marking. To make it random and irregular, you can move the needle position to make wider or narrower spaced lines. I'm using my 20D foot and my Bernina dual feed to machine quilt. This is pretty much the same technique as walking foot quilting, but I can actually see what I'm doing a lot better, and it's much easier to take the foot on and off the machine. My feed dogs are engaged just like for regular sewing, and I've increased my stitch length to 3.0 to compensate for any friction and drag on the quilt. I've reduced my presser foot pressure to 0 so that everything feeds through nice and smoothly and I won't get any puckers. Here's a wider angle of what it looks like as I scrunch and smush the bulk of the quilt through the machine. My drop-in table holds up the weight of the quilt, and I stop and pause and shift the quilt quite a lot. So set your machine to stop with the needle in the down position when you adjust the quilt. The gloves help me grip the quilt as I push it through the machine, and I love having 10 inches of space to the right of the needle. Each time I quilt this design, called random crosshatch, I'm making one pass all the way across the quilt and quilting more lines narrower together. Then I'll rotate and I'll repeat for the lines going in the other direction. You can see that I'm using my hands basically as a hoop and only focusing on the area in between. So I'm stopping quite a bit as I adjust my hands, and that's perfectly fine. By keeping the area in between your hands smooth at all times, this prevents puckers from forming on the quilt. I'll continue this process until I'm happy with the line spacing. So to recap, I'm starting quilting from the right-hand side of the quilt towards the center. Then I rotate the quilt and work my way from the center back to the right-hand side. I do not start quilting in the middle of the quilt because then I'm dealing with too much bulk all at one time. By starting on one edge of the quilt, you gradually increase the bulk, rotate the quilt, and then gradually decrease it again so it's much easier to handle. I'll stop and cut thread once I get to the end of each row of stitching, and then start the next line of quilting again. And the best thing about that spray basting is no pesky pins are getting in the way. This design is very forgiving to stitch, and the texture it adds is really amazing. Now it's time to bind my quilt, and I'll start by trimming up the corners and sides of the quilt with acrylic rulers and a sharp rotary cutter. I prefer to trim the batting flush with the edge of the quilt so that the binding will wrap around nice and tight. This also prevents lumps and bumps from uneven batting. I'll trim up all 4 corners first with the largest square ruler I can find. Then I'll trim up the sides by lining up the ruler with the freshly cut corners as I make my way across the edge of the quilt. See the color weave quilt pattern for the number of binding strips to cut. I like to cut mine 2 inches wide, but the same process applies no matter how wide you like to cut them. I sew the strips right sides together on a 45-degree angle so that I'll get mitered seams. This helps distribute the bulk and makes the joins less noticeable. I'll trim the starting tail at a 45-degree angle and press all seams open. Then I'll press the entire binding in half wrong sides together with a hot, dry iron. I'm going to machine bind this quilt, so I'll sew my prepared binding to the back of the quilt and then flip it over and stitch it down on the front. If I were hand binding, I would do it in the opposite way. I'm going to start stitching away from the edge and leave a bit of starting tail to join up later. When I get to the edge, I crease or mark where the binding is at the edge of the quilt. Then I stop stitching a 1/4 inch away from that line or crease. I'll turn the quilt and sew off the corner at a 45-degree angle. This will help me make nice mitered seams at each corner. Next, fold the binding up and then back down on itself to deal with the bulk in the corners. I call this doing the funky fold. It's important to fold the top down exactly even with the top of the quilt, and the edge of the binding should be even with the edge of the quilt. Then I'll start stitching at the corner. Give it a bit of a push and hold on to your starting threads so you don't create a big mess. I'm stitching accurate 1/4 inch seams with my Bernina dual feed and the 37D foot. When I get back to the start, I'll leave a gap so that I can line up the ends. I'll start with the uncut ending tail and place the trimmed starting tail inside it. Then mark a 45-degree line at the edge of the starting tail so you can match the sewing angle together. Trim 1/2 inch away from the marked line to account for seam allowances on both ends of the binding. Offset the ends by a 1/4 inch and pin them together. Then sew that seam, press it open, and trim off the little dog-eared triangle tips. Finally, pin the unsewn binding to the quilt and stitch it closed. Be sure to sew a little bit on top of the previous starting and stopping threads to secure. Flip the binding over to the front to ensure that you'll be able to cover up the entire edge. I like to secure my edges with Wonder clips. I'll add clips to the entire perimeter of the quilt before I start to sew it down, and then I'll fold down the corners too, in opposite directions of how they were folded on the back. I'm top stitching along the edge of the folded binding. This will match the quilting design so that it becomes a decorative element of the quilt. I'm not too worried about where the stitch is up on the other side of the quilt because it will all just look like part of the machine quilted texture. I'm using the same variegated thread that I used to quilt the quilt. When I get to the corner, I'll stop with the needle right down in the corner and rotate the quilt so that I can ensure that I'm stitching the corner down securely. I'll remove the clips as I go, and I'll continue straight stitching all the way around the edges of the quilt in the same way until I reach my starting point again. I started by stitching a series of teeny tiny stitches to begin, and I'll end with a few tiny stitches, quilting right on top of my previous starting stitches, and it won't be noticeable at all. Next, I'll repeat the whole process by top stitching a second line of quilting all the way around the quilt on the other edge of the binding. This is purely decorative, but it also gives a little bit more strength to the binding. You could even stitch a third line of quilting in between the other two if you wanted to. I really like the way this turned out, and it's a great way to finish your quilt when you're in a hurry. Now it's time to cuddle up and enjoy your finished quilt. Just remember, the best way to hide perfectly imperfect stitches is to surround them with more perfectly imperfect stitches. There you go, another quilt to add to your bucket list. Be sure to share pictures with me and use the hashtag #ColorWeaveQuilt so I can see what you're making. Are you enjoying these do-it-yourself quilting tutorials? I sure hope so. My goal with these tutorials is to help you overcome your fear of quilting it yourself so that you can finish more quilts and have fun doing it. Remember to check the description box below for bonus content and for links on where you can find the pattern to make the color weave quilt yourself. Until next time, happy quilting!